Our first session today starts off with a few tips on planning. This session is called Know Before You Go, the most useful things to learn about a place before traveling. Start your trip off on the right foot with useful knowledge about the place you're traveling to. Naomi Liz from Roaming the Americas has a treasure trove of suggestions and tricks for learning as much about a destination without spending hours of time. And she'll be sharing a lot of those tricks with us today. Naomi Liz loves coffee and is crazy about Latin America, but she's also the writer behind Roaming the Americas. Roaming the Americas is a travel blog that helps people plan responsible travel to engage with culture, support local communities, and protect the environment. A small-town girl from Maine, Naomi has moved to the Philadelphia area, but she's been traipsing around Latin America for the past 15 years whenever she's had the chance. If you have questions or comments, please leave them in the chat window, or you can tweet at us at #ITMSummit17. Thank you so much for being a part of this summit, Naomi, and I'm so excited to learn about how to properly research destinations and get so much good information about culture and history and learning how to start conversations with people and just you've done so much of that in your travels, and I'm excited to learn more.
Yeah, thank you. I'm excited too.
Nice. Yay! So I guess my first question to kind of jump into things is how often do you get out on the road? How often do you travel?
Not as much as I'd like to, of course. That's probably
Me
the
too.
case for many of us. But yeah, I would love to be traveling much more. But in recent years, I haven't done a lot of international travel. I think the last international trip that I took was a couple years ago. Although I guess if you count crossing over the border into Canada for a day, that counts. I'm a Mainer, so it's not on my mind as much. But I do travel within the States pretty often. My family lives in Maine. I live in the Philadelphia area, and my in-laws live in Connecticut and Florida. So much of my husband and my vacation time is spent on road trips or traveling to Florida. So we try to take advantage of those times as well to kind of get some relaxation and seeing some fun sights when we're out.
Absolutely. And we're so blessed to live in a country that has such diversity. I mean, you just go to
Yeah.
any state and it's like seeing a whole new country sometimes with the landscape and the cultures and just so
Hmm.
many amazing things to see. So yeah, I feel very blessed to live in such a great country for travel.
Yes, absolutely.
So I'm curious, what is your planning process like? So when you decide to travel to any place new, what do you start with?
Well, of course, there's, the logistical side of things, just figuring out where to stay and what places I want to go out to eat and just sites to see. So it's a lot of Googling, it's a lot of Pinterest and asking on Facebook. And I'm always looking for more ways to kind of get a little bit more organized with that. So I do use Google Drive to kind of throw ideas into. I also use Google My Maps. I don't know, it's one of those Google apps that not everybody knows about, but
Yeah.
it's one of their many apps, and I can go on my desktop and basically create a map and put pins for places that I want to go, and I can put notes in there, and then I can access it on my phone as I go. But that's kind of like the logistical side of things. I also like to uh, dig into the culture of a place
Mm.
and kind of get to know the story, find out more about the history, find out about the culture. Even if it's like you said, within the United States, even there's a
Mm.
lot of diversity, and just from Philadelphia to Maine, like there's such a culture shift,
Mm.
and I find it fascinating to learn about the history and what a place is like and what it's like to live in a place. So I try to find resources for that. And again, my process isn't exactly linear, but I look for good resources, maybe just books that are set in the place or books about the place. I ask people that live there, questions, and I just try to dig in and get to know it even before I go, because I think it just helps me understand it a little bit better when I'm there.
Nice. So, talking to people that live there, um, I mean, I'm sure if you have friends or family or people that you could reach out to them first. Are there resources that you use if you don't know anyone living there? Is there kind of a process you use to find them?
Yeah, that's a good question. I I I think I tend to use social media a lot. That it's just such a good, quick way to find people. Um, and so I don't exactly have a process for that part of it, but I just reach out on social media and ask. I might just post something on my personal Facebook profile, or I'm in a lot of Facebook travel groups. I'm in probably too many, but I will just post in there, and usually I get some great responses. Whether it's people who have lived there in the past, or maybe are from there, or have family from there, that's a great way to start, I think.
Excellent. Wonderful. Good advice.
Yeah.
Awesome. Um, so you mentioned culture, really looking into culture and history. Are those like the main topics that you really try to dig into when you're researching? Or I guess what are some other topics that you think are important to learn about before visiting a place?
Yeah, I think it can vary. I think it's helpful to look into things that you're interested in, in your own life at home, because you'll tend to be more interested, and it's easy to read about those things. So for me, I am interested in history, and culture and language. Language is a big thing for me as well, and current events. So those are the things that I try to get a little insight on before I go.
Nice. Great. And so I guess speaking to that effect, my husband and his friend are big soccer fans. And so every time they go to Spain or Italy, they try to, keep up to date on the latest, soccer scores and what those teams are doing. And it's a really good conversation starter. I mean, even if you don't speak the local language, sometimes you can find someone who does know a little English, or if you just mention the team name, it's like, hey, go Juventus.
Oh
then,
my goodness, yeah.
then you already have an in.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I lived in Costa Rica for a semester when I was in college, and I can't tell you how many times I heard my host dad yelling for soccer games when they were scoring, and like singing the chant for Costa Rican soccer team. And so that's a great way, especially, I mean, even if you don't love sports, but soccer or football for most of the world, baseball in the Caribbean, finding out what people love, and what they're committed to in the region, it can bring a lot of insight to your trip.
Nice. Awesome. um, so I guess why do you think it's so important to learn about the culture and to really dive into its history before traveling? What are some ideas behind why that is important?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I love talking about this topic, because I actually am a former history hater. I I mean, I hated it in school, elementary school, high school. It was the most boring subject to me, and I really saw it as just I had to learn these dates and memorize names and these battles, and it was such a long time ago. It was just these pictures in textbooks, and it was absolutely boring. I unfortunately never really had a history teacher that made it come alive and helped me see the story of history. And I didn't have that until I studied abroad in Costa Rica. And that semester totally changed how I approach traveling. It changed it forever. And the reason is that their philosophy for traveling and for learning was very experiential. And so they actually had a motto, or it's a quote by somebody, and I can't remember his name, but it says, "In doing, we learn." And so it was just woven into every aspect of our semester. For example, we would study different topics around Latin America. And one that I remember was racism in Costa Rica. And it was towards the beginning of our semester. And, we had tons of reading. We had guest speakers, and we were expected to participate and dialogue and apply the things that we were learning to the conversations we were having in class. But beyond that, we were assigned a paper. It's just a short paper. It was supposed to be based on interviews that we would just have to go out into the street and talk to Costa Ricans about this topic. And so we were assigned, go. We lived in the capital city, and they said go find 2 or 3 white Costa Ricans or Costa Ricans of European descent and ask them about this topic. And then find several Afro-Costa Ricans and talk to them about this topic. And then we took a study trip, like within a few weeks of starting the study, to an area of Costa Rica on the Caribbean coast where most of the Afro-Costa Ricans historically and currently live. And so then when we got there, we also had to ask more people these same kind of questions. And so it was about having those conversations about things that we were studying in class. And we did that for so many different things as we prepared to go to Nicaragua, Cuba, Guatemala, and we were learning about their history. And some of that was like civil wars that are recent enough for me as someone born in the 1980s to remember. Mm-hmm. And that just blew my mind. I thought like, okay, I could have been a little girl and I could remember a civil war, and I could remember like my mom cooking at the stove with a rifle strapped on her back if I had lived in these places. And it just brought it to life so much for me. And the fact that we weren't just learning it in the books, but we were talking to people whose lives had been affected by this. And so that just sort of started a journey for me that now I see how history really shapes culture and culture shapes history. And it's just this interesting journey. And so really for me, learning these things helps to deepen my experience. It helps me connect with locals. If you think about it, when you're at home, what are the things that you talk to your neighbors or your distant relatives around the dinner table, or maybe just your friends, if you want to, be polite in unfamiliar company. But what are those discussions that you're having? Probably in a lot of places, people are also having those conversations about things that are happening in their communities. And so when you can come in and kind of get to dialogue with people about those things, it helps you connect on a deeper level. And so that's one of the main reasons that I love it. I think it also gives you some context and the backstory to understand what's happening now. So, you might see news headlines, and without a backstory or understanding a little bit of the history, and again, it's not about memorizing all these dates and names, it's just about kind of understanding that big picture. Then it helps you to understand what's happening now and kind of piece things together and be able to ask good, engaging questions.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And I think that would really separate, a traveler from a tourist. A traveler is someone who's really actually interested in learning about a place and engaging in some of that culture, even if, you can't learn the language or enough of the language to engage in a full conversation before you go. It still separates you, and it really shows when you have a little bit of knowledge behind, that community and what they've been going through and, maybe what has kind of shaped their culture to begin with, just in a kind of an overview of their history.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I can think of a couple experiences. I know in the Dominican Republic and then in Guatemala, I was there in both of those places during their elections. And so when I was in Guatemala a few years ago, I had been reading the news, or at least some of the headlines. And so I kind of knew, they've got like 14 candidates. And One of them is this like historically significant woman. And I'm curious what people are thinking about all of that. And when I was in the Dominican Republic, I didn't have that backstory, and like the streets were crazy, and I was like, why? What's going on here? And so it just, I think it really helps you have those deeper conversations and brings to light things that you might not notice otherwise.
Exactly. And so the idea of learning so much about a place can be overwhelming at first, especially if people aren't used to doing that kind of legwork.
Yeah.
What are some baby steps? What are some like things that people can start researching and then get more in depth as they go along?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I am all about the idea of it doesn't have to be all or nothing. Like, you don't have to read 5 history books to do this process. I am all about just take baby steps and get curious. And so some very practical ideas that you can try are, one is you can set your homepage browser on your computer to a local newspaper, whether it's the national newspaper of a country or a city newspaper of a city that you're going to travel to soon. So just set your browser homepage to that. And if it's in a foreign language, usually Google will translate it, or they'll have an English version. And that'll just pop up kind of whenever you open up the internet. And most of the time the stories can be grim. So, take it with a grain of salt, or,
news.
Consider that's the same kind of stuff that's probably happening in your own country. But you can kind of just glance over the headlines. It kind of gives you a picture of what's happening. And then if you see something that interests you, like if you're into sports and you see sports headlines that interest you, then click on it maybe once a week or something, whenever something is interesting. Another thing you can do is follow those news outlets on social media, or not just news outlets, but maybe local community organizations, or just a tourism board from that country or that city. Following them on social media, and you'll just kind of start to see things popping up in your newsfeed. And if something interests you, then you can read a little bit more about it. So that's another idea that you can try. Like I said, you can see if you can talk to somebody that's from that place, if you find anybody, or reach out on social media. And another thing that I like to do is look for podcasts. Now, not every place is going to have a podcast or podcast episode about it, but you might be surprised when you start digging some of the ones that are out there. I, for example, know that I want to go to Colombia someday. My dad grew up there, and so it's been on my list for many years. And I came across a podcast called Colombia Calling, and it's just this journalist he's an expat, and he lives in Colombia, and he does a podcast every week, and it's about tons of different topics. But I know that I want to travel there, and so it just kind of gives me a picture of various things, and I try to listen to it occasionally. There's other podcasts that might be like news podcasts. I know if you're trying to learn a language, you might be able to find a news podcast that's intended for language learners. So it's kind of giving you news, and it's in more basic foreign language as well. There's one called News in Slow Spanish and News in Slow Spanish Latino.
Awesome.
So those are options if you're trying to learn Spanish, if you have maybe like a basic to intermediate understanding already. So podcasts are a great option as well. And then lastly, you can read a book or watch a film. And again, these don't have to be like a history book or this history documentary that's super boring. And you might find, and I think they're not all boring. Like, they're not all textbooks or like dry documentaries. There's some really interesting ones out there. But you could also just look for a book or a film that's set in the location that you're traveling to, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. And that can just kind of give you a little bit of the flavor, the local flavor, of that place. It could also be like a topical book, like you were mentioning sports, or if there's another topic that you're interested in, art, music, ballet, anything, you might be surprised as you start to look for it, the resources that are out there. And so you might find books, you might find just articles or interesting films about those places, and that topic. So that would be another suggestion. It's kind of getting a little bit meatier, with the books and films. But again, just take baby steps. And the important thing, I think, is to be curious. And even if it's just one of those small things, or maybe you try one of this and one of that, and try it and see how it goes. I think you hopefully will find that it really enriches the experience. So
Yeah, nice. Something that kind of came to mind when you were talking, when I went to Mexico a while back, I did similar things. I was trying to find, the authentic, real culture of Mexico and not the Cancun experience. And so a friend of mine actually had come across a book that a lot of high schoolers read in Mexico. And so kind of like our, Color Purple or, books that, most everybody reads in America. They have, books that they read in high school. And one book was called Ultima. And it was kind of this magical story about a grandmother who was also the town witch. And but it weaved so much of that culture from that community into the story, and really kind of like through the story of this boy who has all these fun experiences. He's learning about his world, and so is the reader. And so I was able to find an English translation of the book, and I read that. And when I visited Mexico, I just felt like I had a different context, than if I hadn't read something. And
yeah, absolutely. I love that. Like, that's such a great idea. That's awesome.
Yeah, I figured from now on, it's like I'm going to try to get a list of the books that the students have to read in high school and see if I can find an English version or.
And also, this is not as maybe enlightening or studious, but Netflix has a lot of foreign shows on there. And so some of them, like if you're trying to learn the language or you have intermediate language level, you can watch it in the foreign language. But if you don't, then you can watch the English subtitles. And I mean, I watched a Colombian soap opera last year, which was a soap opera, but it was still, I still felt like I was getting pieces of the culture, just through the language and how they spoke to each other. And it wasn't an American show translated to Spanish. It was a Colombian show. So that's another.
Absolutely. And getting that communities or cultures media that they might be watching on a regular basis. I think that's a wonderful window into, either a conversation starter, like you said, or just kind of, seeing how they view the world, possibly.
Yeah, exactly.
Nice. So what have been some of the more trickier destinations to research? Maybe places that it is harder to find sometimes credible information as well.
I think the one, I would say the place that comes to mind for me the most would be Cuba. Now, a lot of the places that I traveled were with my study abroad program, so I was given the information. I was given the packets of material that I had to read. And I did first go to Cuba with them. So I kind of had a little bit to start with, but I went again in 2014. And I think the thing that is challenging about Cuba is that there tends to be a lot of biased information. And that might be true in other places, but I don't think it's as strong of storylines as with Cuba. When I went with my study abroad program in 2004, we read excerpts of a book called Cuba, Neither Heaven Nor Hell. And it was written by a woman who was Cuban American and went back to research. And that has always stuck with me because I kind of just saw like the biased information that we got in the United States and then some of the biased information that I got on the ground in Cuba. Um, and so I would say that's maybe the more challenging destination
Okay.
to research.
Yeah, I could absolutely see that. Especially, for us Americans who have always seen a different side of Cuba. We've always seen the romanticized version with, old cars and, Cuba Libres.
Yeah, that, and then, but then also like a very specific story about the Cuban Revolution and Fidel Castro.
Yes.
That maybe is not the whole picture, and I think it's a complex topic, so I don't want to get too far into it.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, it's complex. I think that's the thing, and so the what I've done in terms of just learning about Cuba is trying to find those resources that are as unbiased as possible, but then also reading both. Not just reading one and not the other, but reading some of the biased stuff on this side and some on that side.
Absolutely. And yeah, by getting all those different perspectives, hopefully you can come to a reliable perspective yourself of what you're walking into.
Exactly.
Great. Yeah, I guess that kind of gets into like how do you know that the facts you're researching are correct? And like you said, if you're reading newspapers, sometimes those facts might not be correct. Sometimes they are. Just like with our own newspapers, there's a slightly different take on a story. And so I guess, is there anything that you do to make sure that what you're learning is as accurate as possible?
There is, I think when I'm researching on, or just reading on things like blogs or just any old website, and I try to look for ones that maybe are citing where they're getting the information.
Okay.
As a blogger myself, I'm not dissing on bloggers, but I have unfortunately read some blogs that I knew had incorrect information or misinformation. And, so for myself, when I am writing blogs, I try to cite those sources. So if I'm reading blogs, they're providing that information, and I try to click through and read it. But I think just as much as possible going as close to the source as possible. So whether it's looking at governmental websites, reputable news organizations, and just trying to take in a variety of content to kind of like fact check that. So I don't know that I necessarily have like a specific process, but I try to remember to check myself and to check and to just remember like, oh, there's bad information out there, and just make sure to do my due diligence.
Okay, great. That's good advice.
Yeah.
Definitely. I'm curious, so when you're going to a place, you've learned as much about it. Sometimes, I know for me, sometimes if I do so much research, I get an idea in my head as to how this culture is gonna be. And so I set myself up for, maybe a different kind of experience. But there's always culture shock. There's always, the way that I'm envisioning it is never the way it really is. And that's one of the wonderful parts of travel. But how do you handle culture shock?
Yeah. It's a challenge. I think one of the most important things is giving yourself space as you're traveling to process, and allowing yourself to have some of that white space and some of that downtime where you're not always go, go, go. You're not always necessarily interacting with people from that culture. I think you need time to kind of decompress and be alone with your thoughts. So whether that's, and sometimes it's not totally alone. So some of the ways that I have found helpful in processing and reflecting on my own cultural assumptions, my own cultural behaviors, why I felt a certain way in a situation, or, there's been many times where I realized right after I did something like, I am such an American. I cannot believe I just did that. And, so sometimes I realize it right then, but sometimes it really takes having that alone time and writing in a journal. I know when I was studying abroad, like that was gold, that time where I could just write about all of my experiences, just very openly and not worrying about how I sounded or if I was being judgmental or if I was, would be embarrassing. I could just really write out all my thoughts and process through those things. Another thing that helps, I think, is processing through it with other people. If you're traveling with someone else that's also from your home culture, just kind of processing it with them and talking about your experiences with them in a very intentional way. And also, if you have somebody from your host culture that you have an open enough relationship with where they could kind of give you cultural feedback, that those can be good conversations as well. But realize, like, if you don't have a close relationship with somebody in another culture, they may not feel comfortable, depending on what their culture is like, to give you that feedback. But really, in a nutshell, I think a really important thing as you're there and as you come back from the trip is having that white space and allowing yourself time to reflect.
Absolutely. I felt similar. Sometimes the first few days, my husband and I just went to Rome. And so the first few days, it was crazy. I was expecting people, but I was not expecting, people smoking everywhere and trash everywhere. And I guess I had in my mind, a better, picture of cleaner streets and, and things like that. And so I'm walking around, I'm like, this isn't as beautiful as I thought it was going to be. and I had to step back and be like, okay, that was in my head. This is, what Rome is really about. And so after we got off the beaten paths and we started walking down, the little streets, and I could actually see, locals doing, what they do every day. And it was beautiful. It had its own beauty. And so it was just me getting out of my bubble. And seeing the culture for what it really is. And it was gorgeous. And I came back and I don't remember any of the negative parts of the trip. I don't remember my feet, hurting after 14 miles of walking. And, it's all about, the wonderful food and the, amazing people that we met. And those are the things you come back with. And, I think you have to remember that in the moment when things get overwhelming is, you're going to remember the good parts. And it's all going to be worth it.
Yeah.
Awesome. So where are you headed to next? What's your next big adventure?
Yeah, that's a good question. I have a potential trip coming up, and it's not all finalized yet. So I don't know if I'm still doing it yet, but it's somewhere in Canada. And so I have been having fun kind of researching that. And other than that, I am going to be going to Boston next month, which I've been to. As a New England girl, that was like the big city, the only city pretty much 4 hours away from where I lived. But I haven't been back as an adult, so I'm going to be there for a conference for a few days.
Nice.
So that should be fun as well.
Yeah. Have you learned anything interesting and new about these new destinations you're headed to?
Yeah, so where I'm potentially traveling to in Canada, I have been researching a lot about the Indigenous culture there, and I found out about this place that where the Indigenous tribes, and I don't know the names of which tribes are in that area, but where they used to hunt buffalo, and it's this big cliff. Or bison, I'm sorry. I guess, I don't know, bison and buffalo are technically different, but they use both things. But they would herd or stampede the buffalo off the edge of this cliff in order to hunt them for like the winter, to have food for the winter. And they use every part of the bison, which I think is awesome. And historically, I don't think they do it anymore, but historically they used to run them off the edge of this cliff. So I thought it was very intriguing, and I hope to be able to visit that that location if they go.
Yeah. Gets the job done,
Yeah.
I suppose. Wow, very cool.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for sharing all your advice and your insight. Is there anything that we didn't cover that you think would be useful for viewers and when it just comes to learning about places before you travel?
I think we covered quite a bit of good stuff. I would just encourage everyone, like I said, stay curious and just be open to learning. If this is
Mhm.
something new for you, you don't have to be overwhelmed. You don't have to like dig in and read 10 books. Just do one thing for your next trip and and then see, if you get to have any conversations with people as you're traveling and yeah, see where it takes you.
Yeah. Nice, nice. And I know I've talked to a lot of people who they get nervous about talking about some of these subjects, or they don't think that they're going to find someone who speaks English, or like how do I like this is a really cool topic. How do I talk about it in another language? You always have your guides. If you have a local guide, you can always have them interact. Have a conversation, or maybe have them help you have a conversation with a shop owner or someone. But yeah, I mean, it's I guess about connecting.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I love language, and so I definitely encourage people to, if they're going to a place, learn at least a little bit of the language. Now that might not allow you to have conversations, but if you're interested in diving deeper, um, I would definitely encourage you to do your best to learn as much of the language as you can. And again, if not, there's in a lot of places people that speak English, like you said, a guide, or if you go to a museum, places that tend to cater to tourists or have foreign visitors will be likely to speak English, and that's a great place to start if you don't speak the language.
Great. Wonderful. Well, thank you again, and it's so great having you here. And like I said, your advice is very valuable.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was so fun, and I'm super excited to just be part of this summit and hear from all the other speakers. It's going to be awesome.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you.